Hi, everyone. I'm Michal Avram. I'm a senior writer with Fortune based in the California Bay Area. And I'm thrilled to be here with two very impressive and innovative thinkers today. Yuval Noah Harari is historian and best-selling author and a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And Andrew Yang is the founder of the Forward Party. I know I mentioned your titles. You two are a whole lot more than that, but I'd like to know how you present yourselves to the world, what makes you tick, and what is something that you're working on right now that you're excited about. And Andrew, I'm going to start with you.
Hi, it's great to be here with you all. And Yuval, you've been an inspiration to a lot of what I've spent the last number of years making a case for. When you ask how I describe myself, I consider myself an entrepreneur and problem solver. The issue here in the States is that a lot of the biggest problems are not issues that the private markets are going to address. They're issues that you would need an activated and invigorated government and public space to address, and that's not really happening in the US. So I ran for president on a platform of universal basic income because I believe that AI and automation are going to transform the labor markets of the US in a way that's going to push many, many people to the side. We're already seeing a version of that. And now I have founded the Forward Party because the American duopoly is not designed to advance meaningful solutions. It's designed to polarize and inflame, and it's going to lead to conflict and potential strife. Well, not even potential strife. I mean, the strife is here. I was going to say potential civil war, but I thought that might seem a little bit sensationalist.
Maybe not sensationalist, sadly. Yuval, over to you. Tell us about yourself.
So I'm a historian, but I'm a historian that defines history as the study not of the past, but as the study of change, which covers also the present and the future. And I work on all kinds of things. Maybe the most important things I'm working on right now is a children's book, a history of the world for kids aged 10, 11, something like that, which is probably the most difficult or also fun project I've ever worked on.
Well, I have a 9-year-old boy, so you have a customer.
Okay.
Yes, I have some kids too who will love to read it, and hopefully your book doesn't throw them into an existential crisis, right? Because
I don't think so.
For me. All right. Very exciting. You're both working on big things, and again, are very big thinkers. The theme of Nexus Israel this year is sustainability. This is a big word. It can mean different things to different people, and I want to hear from both of you. What does it mean to you? What are the issues within the umbrella of sustainability, whether it's climate and environment or population, food systems, and of course, future of work and implications to the workplace? What are the issues within sustainability that you are most closely looking at and that your work intersects with? And let's go to Yuval first this time.
So I think that sustainability is basically about survival. About the survival of humanity, the survival of human civilization, and also the survival of the ecological system as we know it. It all now depends on us. We have the power to destroy our civilization. We have the power to destroy, not the world, because that's impossible. There will always be something after us, but to destroy much of the existing ecological system. And maybe the most difficult part of all that is the potential to destroy the very meaning of humanity. That the technologies that we are now developing, they threaten the physical survival of trees and of animals and of human beings, but they also potentially threaten the mental or psychological or even philosophical survival of what we used to mean by humanity. And you can approach this issue for many directions. I mean, I'll say just one thing that I've been working on lately, that if we focus on the more physical threat to the ecological system, what strikes me as a historian is that the kind of political project needed in order to prevent ecological collapse is actually within reach of the current political system. the best estimates that I found say that in order to prevent catastrophic climate change and ecological collapse, we just need to invest 2% more of global GDP every year than what we are doing already. And 2% of global GDP is a lot of money, but it's completely feasible politically. If it was something like 20% or 40%, I would say that it's a political impossibility. But at a price tag of 2%, politicians, this is their job. They are quite good at shifting 2% of resources from here to there. So I hope they do their job.
I'm sure Andrew has some thoughts about that. Andrew, can you tell us? Why aren't they doing their job? But tell us first what sustainability means to you. What matters to you most when we talk about this topic?
Well, it's about whether we're going to be passing a habitable environment to our kids and grandkids. At this point, the changes are manifesting around us in sometimes tragic form. And it really does encapsulate some of our biggest challenges that relate to the labor market as well. So in the U.S., you have these two warring mindsets of abundance and scarcity. And if you go to an American and say, hey, we need to move towards sustainable energy sources, and they're in a mindset of scarcity, they might hear that and say, oh, that's going to mean higher prices. It's going to mean fewer jobs for people like me. And they don't react positively to it necessarily. Meanwhile, as the environment is changing and you have more frequent storms and flooding and the like, that also induces a mindset of scarcity. Unfortunately, it's actually a negative loop. It's not like when someone has some extreme weather, they think, oh, we should move towards sustainable energy as quickly as possible. They actually are more likely to crouch and become defensive and shut down. And so the challenge for the U.S. is really to try and have a policy-making organ that can overcome market incentives and market forces. And right now, the U.S. is struggling very much with that. There is a political market and political incentives that people are now held captive to. And that's keeping us from being able to solve the biggest problems, including how to try and transition to more sustainable forms of energy. There's a growth imperative that's tied into our capitalist system and our stock market system, where you look and say, well, the goal of these companies is to grow. And sometimes right now that growth is running at cross purposes to a more habitable planet.
Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. I just want to remind everybody, this is a conversation that's really about the nexus of AI and technology, public policy, sustainability, and the future of work. Clearly a lot of topics there, but all interrelated. I want to focus on the future of work specifically for a bit here, because you both have very interesting thoughts. You've both looked very closely at the disruption that AI and machine learning have brought about. We're currently experiencing this. This is not just the future, right? Yuval, can you talk a little bit about why this particular disruption is different from previous disruptions, or could be different from previous disruptions to how we work?
Because it's moving much faster and it's much bigger. It's really the first time in history when we have no idea how the job market would look like in 20 years. So, and this makes it much more difficult to prepare people, to prepare countries for this. Now, I don't believe that jobs will just disappear. Yes, some jobs will disappear. Other jobs, new jobs will emerge. But we need to prepare for that. We need to prepare for that, for instance, in the educational system. And we have really no idea what to teach kids today in school so that they will have a job or skills, the necessary skills in the job market of 2040 or 2050. And we have never been in this situation before. Also, what's different is that now the machines are competing with us, not just in physical skills, but also in mental and cognitive skills, including things which were considered to be kind of the hallmark of what it means to be human. Now machines are increasingly competing with us in creativity, They are increasingly competing with us even in some forms of emotional intelligence. So the kind of naive thinking that says that any job that involves creativity or any job that involves emotional intelligence is safe, this is simply not true. It's often quite counterintuitive which jobs are safe and which jobs are likely to be replaced faster. Very often jobs which have kind of high social status and high pay are more easily replaceable. If you compare, say, doctors and nurses in the hospitals, in the healthcare system, so we might think that it's harder to replace the doctors. After all, they get higher pay. But actually, at least some doctors are much easier to replace than nurses. If the main job of a doctor is basically to analyze data, the doctor receives information about the condition of the patient, has to analyze it, to compare it with all kinds of models and reach a conclusion about what is the illness and what could be done about it. This job, which basically is just data processing, this is easily replaceable. In contrast, a nurse, which has to change a bandage, which has to give a painful injection, needs motor skills, needs social skills, which are far more difficult to automate. So it's not easy to predict which jobs are in the greatest danger of being replaced. But the main thing is that we really, the AI revolution is just, 5, 6, 7 years old. We haven't seen anything yet. The really big shocks are still ahead of us. And we have no idea what is coming. We have no idea how the job market would look like in 20 years. So we just don't know how to prepare people for this kind of world.
Very reassuring. Andrew, what are your thoughts? Do you think of job displacement, future of work, when you think of sustainability? Is that part of your worry as well?
Well, all of these issues are tied together, and we're in the midst of this transition and dealing with it terribly, dealing with it by ignoring it, at least in the US. So when I ran for president, I would make the case, look, we've lost 5 million manufacturing jobs, primarily in the Midwest, in the states that Trump won. And the majority of those were due to automation. And one of the things that I've come to realize is that the American political system does not care about what happens to any number of manufacturing workers or call center workers or food service workers or whatnot. That there is no feedback mechanism anymore. And over 2 million Americans right now work in call centers. Yuval, when do you think AI is going to be able to replace a call center worker? Probably yesterday. And that's an obvious one. There are dozens of inobvious ones within the guts of major corporations that aren't going to make any headlines. When I talk to executives, as I'm sure you do, Yuval, they all look and if you're not on a stage and there's no camera on, they'll say, oh yeah, like we're going to be able to replace like a significant percentage of our workers. And then if they have a press release, they'll say, we'll find new work for them. But then as soon as you, that really doesn't make much sense on the face of it in a lot of these contexts. So it's happening. The United States labor force participation rate continues to decline. It's aberrantly low by international standards. More and more men are being kicked to the curb, and then they're dealing with it by either self-destructing or becoming radicalized. And a study just came out last week that said that if you've been prone to automation, you are much more likely to join a far-right group or an extremist left group. The majority join far-right groups. So when I opened by talking about my concerns for civil war, it's being driven by the automation of millions of repetitive manual and repetitive cognitive jobs.
Okay, I think this is a good segue to talk solutions. I realize it's a little bit hard to do that in some ways because, Yuval, as you laid out, we don't quite know what the job skills 20, 40 years out, what job skills will be necessary then. So it's hard to prepare maybe in that sense. But I'm curious to hear from both of you, what are possible solutions or at least mitigators here? And what role do you see government playing, and what role do you see companies playing, and any other entities? Andrew, I'm going to start with you, actually. I know you have, this is probably a good segue to universal basic income as well, because I think that's probably one thing that you would say is a solution, or a potential solution. And Yuval, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this too.
Here's what the average politician will say in response to this question. We need to retrain Americans, or whoever you're talking about, for the jobs of the future. We need to invest in lifelong learning and overhaul our educational system. The problem is that most of those things won't happen and probably won't work for the majority of the affected people. It's just a talking point. It's illusory. It's actually doing us all a disservice. So if you play out what's happening in the American job market, second most common job in the US, retail clerk. And those jobs are disappearing like that because now stores are shutting down and people just want to order things online. So if you listen to the dictates of the market, you're going to lose catastrophically, because there really is no market need for an unemployed cashier or an unemployed call center worker, or before too long, an unemployed limo or truck driver. So what you have to do is get yourself off of what the market is saying. Trying to get people to become market competitive when they're 50 years old and don't have any meaningful skills won't work. It's a waste of time. What you have to do is actually give rise to a different type of market that values people intrinsically, not because they can outcompete the AI. They're not going to be able to outcompete the AI. It's a total loser. So one of the fun things about this, Yuval, one reason why your books are so influential on me, is that when I wrote my book, The War on Normal People, upon which I premised my presidential run, I just wanted it to be straight facts and economics, just be like, look, like I'm just going to make a completely grounded argument and let people grapple with it. But what quickly happened to me is that you wind up having to grapple with, why are we here? What is our purpose? What is the meaning of human existence? Because as soon as you unlock someone from the market, then you're looking at those questions. And when you're looking at those questions at the scale you would have to in, let's say, a $22 trillion economy, you need the government to actually help devise these new structures and markets for things that will help other people that right now the market will ignore. Caregiving, helping your neighbor, volunteering, things that right now we wouldn't dream about necessarily putting a monetary value on. It's one reason why, to me, we should be looking at multiple forms of currency.
Yuval, your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think that
I want to say real quick, Andrew, you skirted around universal basic income, but we didn't quite get to it. So Yuval, if you want to touch on it, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so first of all, I agree that, I mean, what we need is to protect people and not to protect jobs, which is a different way of thinking about this crisis. Ultimately, it's the people that count, not the jobs. There are many jobs which are not really worth saving. We need them if they are essential for human dignity and the ability of humans to sustain themselves. But if we can find alternative ways to do it, there is no point in just keeping the jobs. Now, with regard to universal basic income, you know, it's a long discussion. For me, the key issue is, what do you mean by universal? Most of the time, it means national. It means the US government imposing taxes on the big corporations that make trillions out of the new technology, and using it in order to help in many different ways the people who lose their jobs in driving trucks or in call centers. But the biggest problems, I think, from a global perspective, will not be in the United States. The United States is a very rich country. It's leading the new technological revolution. It will benefit enormously from it, whether it goes in the direction of retraining the workforce, or whether it goes in the direction of universal basic income, or a combination of the two. It has the resources to do it. And it will have more and more resources because it's leading this revolution. The really big problems will be in Mexico, will be in Guatemala, will be in Egypt, that their economies are even more vulnerable to the automation revolution, and they don't have the kind of resources, and they will not benefit from all the rise of AI and machine learning. So what are they going to do? How are you going? Again, it doesn't matter whether you're thinking in terms of retraining people for the new economy, or in terms of building a new kind of social contract and protecting the people and not the jobs. Either way, it's going to cost a lot of money. Where will the government of Guatemala or Egypt get the money to do this kind of thing? And this was what really worries me. I completely agree with Andrew that the US is facing its own huge difficulties, but it also has the resources, if they are used correctly, to deal with it. The big problems are going to be actually elsewhere, which again, it's not a prophecy that the US will do it. I mean, it could completely, even though it has the resources, it could completely mismanage the crisis. And yes, even civil war is not an impossibility. But at least it has kind of a horizon of how to do it. I'm afraid that there are many countries which is, if you don't think in kind of in terms of a global safety net, they just can't do it on their own.
Andrew, you also brought up some really interesting and worrying points about what happens when people are displaced, their jobs are displaced, that is, and sort of rise in extremism. Yuval, I know you've given this some thought as well. Mm-hmm. Where can we look to history and see what does happen when we don't find meaning in work? Where do we turn to as humans? Have I stumped you?
No, it's a big question. I need to think.
You need to write another book.
Yes. Meaning humans are very, very good at inventing new schemes for meaning. The history of religion and ideology are full of these examples of how humans are able to give meaning to just about anything. And the Hebrew University is in Jerusalem, which is one of the main meaning factories of history, one of the main meaning centers of the world. And so I'm less worried on that front. We will see either old religions and ideologies reinventing themselves, which they've always done. I mean, all religions are new. Even the religions that say that they are an eternal truth from thousands of years ago, when you look at the actual history, you see that they are constantly reinventing themselves and adapting to new economic conditions, to new technological conditions. Look at Judaism or Christianity. They are the product of an ancient information technology revolution, the invention of writing and the invention of the book, which, I mean, they are really religions based on information technology. Previously, the word of God came to humans through humans. You lived in a tribe, so there was the local shaman or there was the local priest or prophet, and if you wanted to hear the word of the divine, you had to speak with a human. Then came a new information technology and displaced the human, or there was at least an attempt to take the humans out of the loop. Because humans are fallible and corruptible, then we don't want the word of God to come from the mouth of a human. How can we trust the human? So let's get the human out of the way and put our trust instead in this revolutionary new information technology, the book. Of course, there was an initial problem of who would write the book. So you brought together humans who wrote the book, but then in an act of collective forgetfulness, you ignored the fact that humans wrote the book, and you kind of had this make-believe that the book just came to us. And now you can trust the technology, the information technology, the book, and not the humans. So these kinds of games, they have been going on throughout history. What is really new is the situation when you can get humans out of the loop in the economy. And it is technically, from a purely economic perspective, you don't need the humans. We can imagine a future world in which, corporations managed by algorithms that control robots are selling products to other corporations managed by algorithms and controlling robots, and they make trillions upon trillions of dollars, and there are very few humans in the loop, if at all. This is really unprecedented, and we need to think really hard and really fast how to deal with it.
Yeah, Yuval, I said in my book that humans need work more than work needs us, which is kind of the problem. In terms of what happens when people are idle, it actually diverges based on gender, which might not be shocking to the people watching this. But women are more likely to go back to school, more likely to volunteer, more likely to help those around them and adapt. Men in the US volunteer at lower levels than employed men, even though they have much more time on their hands. Video game consumption goes up, gambling goes up, alcohol consumption goes up, self-destructive behaviors go up, and also apparently going down internet rabbit holes and becoming part of an alt-right group all go up. So the void of meaning gets filled in various ways that are generally not very constructive for men in particular. And that this, to me, is one of the stealth drivers behind what you're seeing in the US. I'm not sure if it's playing out similarly in other parts of the world. I did talk to a scholar who suggested that ubiquitous internet and social media has had similar effects elsewhere.
Okay, more video games and gambling. Awesome. I'm going to completely change gears here. This is fascinating, and I feel like we could go down that rabbit hole for a very long time. But let's talk about innovation and about sustainability. Go back to talking about sustainability in the way that most people are thinking about it, which is more from an environmental perspective. I want to hear from both of you. What are you seeing that's coming out of research and academia, from startups, from entrepreneurs, maybe even bigger companies, that is going to hopefully help to usher in a more sustainable era for us? I want you guys to think broadly, not just renewable energy, obviously, but really rethinking models, rethinking education, anything else that comes to mind. And then we can also get into, okay, that's all great, but how does it get implemented and actually have impact? So whoever wants to take that first, please jump in.
Well, I have friends who are very excited about the potential of AI to improve our sustainability, everything from materials design to obviously dynamic consumption and pricing. Right now, the American power grid is very, very 20th century, and we're kind of paying for blanket provision of energy, whether it's being used optimally or not. To your second point, the real question is in the transition, and I keep referring to this because the U.S. has a hard time pulling back on anything that's going to eliminate jobs in large numbers. Like very, very savvy industries essentially lobby diligently and spread out their activities so that there's a critical mass of legislators who say, hey, you can't touch this because it's going to reduce jobs in my district. And so like trying to manage the transition effectively is a problem politically here.
Well, I would say that recently the greatest contribution to a sustainable future has been made by Vladimir Putin, who has exposed the political risk, especially for Europe, of relying on oil, continuing to relying on fossil fuels. Russia is basically a gas station with nukes. And especially the Europeans now understand that they have no time and they have no option. They have to win themselves as quickly as possible from the old energy system. And there is nothing like war to concentrate the minds of politicians, of industrialists, and of ordinary citizens and voters on solving big problems. So I hope that out of this terrible war, which is now happening, at least one potentially good outcome would be a green Manhattan project, led probably by Europe, which, if it succeeds, it will have repercussions all over the world. Because if the Europeans can do it for themselves, then their system and their inventions could be copied elsewhere around the world. Given the time frame that we are facing with the threat of ecological collapse, I think that technology is our best bet. It's not, ideally, we should kind of step back and rethink how we've built our society, rethink the capitalist system and all that, but there is just no time for it. I think that at the situation we are here now, we first need a technological breakthrough in order to buy us time, and later on we can then think about how to rebuild human society on different foundations.
So, Yuval, do you think that what we're seeing unfold with Putin, with what Putin has ushered in, do you think that, just going back to what you were saying earlier about that 2% of GDP, is that what it could potentially lead to longer term? Or do you think there's a risk?
I think that both globally and even focusing just on, say, Europe, we have the scientific knowledge and we have the economic and financial power to solve, to prevent catastrophic climate change. What we lack is the political motivation. And maybe, just maybe, Putin has just provided the necessary political motivation. He's lit a fire under Europe, and it's getting very, very hot. And again, if they set their minds to it, and I think, again, it's not just, blaming a few politicians, why don't you do something? It's also the public. The politicians, these are democracies. The politicians are they are attuned to what the voters want, to what the voters are willing to accept. And hopefully now the voters would push hard enough for the politicians to make use of, again, the resources are there, the money is there, the scientific knowledge is there. We just need the motivation. And this also kind of reflects on the other issues that we have been discussing about the rise of AI and the threat to the job market and the threat to many other things, because AI is threatening not just the job market, it's also threatening the very foundations of democracy and of human liberty. And again, it's not an impossible problem. We have the knowledge and resources to solve it. We don't have the motivation. When I look at election campaigns around the world, including the US, so what you see is that the vast majority of parties and politicians, they just don't talk about these issues. What's the difference between Democrats and Republicans in the US in their preferred policy on AI? I have no idea. They just don't talk about these things. And similarly, I look at Israel. What's the difference between the left and the right in their preferred policy on AI? Nobody has any idea. They just don't talk about these things, even though potentially these are maybe the most important questions of our generation.
Yeah, they don't talk about them because they don't understand them in some cases, and that there's not a lot of popular energy behind it. And what you're describing in terms of the investment in sustainability, there would be short-term cost for long-term gain. And right now, the time horizon of political figures in the U.S. is approximately 12 months. Like if something's going to help, like 10 years from now, everyone's like, well, I'm going to be long gone by then.
I'm not sure I agree, because if you tell the story right, people do care and do vote about issues which are decades in the future. And here we can take inspiration from these alt-right groups, which you have just mentioned. I mean, some of the most explosive issues that these groups unite around are immigration. You have these conspiracy theories that some conspiracy is trying to replace white people with immigrants, or that in so and so many years the United States will be ruled by immigrants. Or I know from Britain you have far-right groups talking about 2066. 1,000 years exactly after the Battle of Hastings, they predict in 2066 Asians and Africans will be the majority in Britain. And even though this is like 40 years in the future, it gets people very excited right now. It gets people voting for these politicians right now. So I mean, when you think about immigration, you see that people are able to be very strongly politically motivated about things that I consider to be fantasies and conspiracies, okay, but everybody agrees it's decades in the future. So how come immigration can get people to, be up in arms about something that will happen in 30 years, but AI or climate change doesn't? I think to a large extent it has to do with our psychology, with the way that our emotional system is built, and with the stories we tell.
Well, it's emotional and cultural and tribal in a way that national competitiveness is not. Where you have in America a functional gerontocracy. The average senator is 63 years old, and leadership is significantly older than that. Our two major presidential candidates in 2024 could be a combined 158 years old. So if you ask people about AI and national competitiveness, it's much more of an abstraction. They are not going to win or lose elections based upon their success making us globally competitive, even though you'd like to think that they would. At this point, you have this narrowly polarized country, and then you're going to be fighting over this sliver, and you figured out that you can activate them more effectively using various emotional, cultural, and tribal cues, as opposed to making a more rational, competence-based appeal.
Well, and now that we've established that xenophobia elicits a stronger reaction in humans than the fear of environmental collapse, I want to ask both of you, are you generally optimistic about the direction we're headed or not? And Yuval, I'll start with you.
I mean, I'm happy to take this
Andrew,
one
go
first. Like I'm like a data-driven fellow.
What does the data tell us?
And everything else. And so I look at where the incentives and the forces lie. And right now you have billions and billions of dollars being spent on keeping people separated into ideological camps. You have hundreds of millions being spent on lobbying to make sure that there are no significant structural changes that are undertaken that might negatively affect industry. And so then if you were going to be optimistic, you would need to be able to point to an equivalently powerful countervailing force or set of forces. And right now, it's hard to identify those forces. If you were to take someone like Yuval and say, well, it's obvious we should be investing 2% more of global GDP in sustainability, I think most people listening to this right now would say, yeah, like that works for me. But then when the rubber hits the road, like how can you get the U.S. to spend an additional, $400 to $500 billion a year on sustainability, like in the current climate? And then you have various groups who are lobbying for it who are, like not going to be able to make that happen. And then you have a population that, to the extent they want that, their will is not going to be translated into policy, truly. So if you ask me, like, am I optimistic or pessimistic? I'm an entrepreneur. I try and solve problems, and we have our pick of them. And so I wake up every day energized to do what I can. But my perspective of the future is fueled by the level of resource that are being invested in the facts on the ground. And those things are not painting a positive picture.
Yuval?
Well, I mean, looking at again, the question of resources, the optimistic thing to say is that humanity is more powerful than in any previous time in history. And many problems which throughout history were simply, uncontrollable forces of nature, or things that humans can't do anything about, we do have the tools, we do have the capacity to control them, to overcome them. And a good case, a good example is epidemics, is plagues. When you compare the world when it faces COVID to the world when it faced the Black Death in the Middle Ages, or even the Spanish influenza in 1918, in the Middle Ages, humanity was simply incapable of doing anything meaningful. Nobody had the scientific and technological resources to even understand what is happening, let alone do anything workable, like find out how to quarantine people effectively, how to develop a vaccine, how to develop medications. It was just impossible. Now we have the resources, and this is a good news. These problems are turning into manageable problems. They are no longer uncontrollable forces of nature. But then, just having the resources and the tools is not enough. We also need the wisdom and the political motivation to use the resources and tools well. And here COVID presents a very kind of pessimistic example, because the last 2 years have frankly been, scientific triumph coupled with political failure. The tools were there, but the leadership was not. The politicians didn't use the tools effectively. And it's the same with the now war in Ukraine. That, for the first time in history, in the last few generations, humanity, because of economic and technological reasons, have reached a situation when war is now a manageable problem. But it doesn't mean that we actually make the right decisions in time. That something is a manageable problem is not a guarantee that we will actually, or the leaders will actually make the right decisions. So whether you look at it as optimistic or pessimistic, I'm not sure. It certainly places a much weightier burden on the shoulders of politicians. In the Middle Ages, if you had a plague going on, you couldn't blame the king. What could the king do about it? And if you had a war going on, again, that's just part of the way the world is. Now, the tools are there to stop it. So we need good politicians more than ever before. As a scientist, as a scholar, I'm completely against these kinds of chimerical ideas that you can replace politicians with somebody else, that you can replace politicians with scholars, or you can replace politicians with scientists. No, you can't. It's a completely different line of work. You just need good politicians. There are good politicians around. I'm also against this idea that all politicians are liars, or all politicians, it's not true.
Part of it, Yuval, is that it's the context you place people in, where if you have this incredibly powerful and somewhat corruptive set of incentives, you could take a reasonable moral person and then instead of delivering what their vision might have been initially, they'll end up delivering a very, very diluted or watered down version of it. I personally am for someone like you having massive influence in public policy, because there are going to be times when that's the kind of thinking that would be very, very vital. And it's one reason why I think you play such an important role, is like you energize a lot of people, including the people who are here today, to think about things differently and bigger, and then hopefully that can create the energy to move the political figures. But and it may be different in Israel or in other parts of the world, but there does need to be some kind of shift, because the governance structures are so overrun now by various interests that they're unable to shake free and do anything that's going to address some of the biggest problems of our time.
Yeah, well, energize. I can energize people, but I definitely.
You're not running for anything, you all.
No, I mean, I know myself. I don't. I mean, to be a politician, you need to be good at, making compromises and making deals and making alliances. And I know myself. I'm not that kind of person. It's a different. It's a job with a set of skills, and yes, I mean, we have some institutional problems in the U.S. in Israel, but there are always institutional problems. I think, again, I'm a medievalist. My specialty was the Middle Ages. So every time people tell me about how bad things are now, politically or whatever, I compare this to the Middle Ages and I become a bit more optimistic because, things then were much, much, much worse. What we consider like, terrible corruption was just the standard. In the Middle Ages. I mean, appointing your son to be the next president, yes, obviously. I mean, how else can a political system... Yeah, how else can a political system function unless you appoint your son to succeed you? So we've managed to advance a little over the last 1,000 years or so. And again, I think that part of the issue is time. We don't have time to reinvent the political system or to reinvent the democratic system. And I think that the current system, if it faces a big enough shock, it can pull itself together.
And again, make a case where at least the U.S. political system does need to modernize, because right now we're trapped in an artificial duopoly that was not the original founding design. It was implanted decades later, and then now it's paralyzing us and turning us against each other. And we need to have more than two political parties, which I believe Israel has significantly more.
I'm not sure we can teach you a lot about how to manage a successful democracy.
I know you all have issues as well, but anyway, I'll stop there. But there's like a need for an evolution here in the U.S. And the funny thing is, in the U.S., it would be actually closer to our founding principles of multiple shifting factions.
So maybe I'll say just one thing about it from a historical perspective, that the great thing about democracy is that democracy has self-correcting mechanisms and is able, more than any other political system, to learn from its mistakes. In a dictatorship, because all power is concentrated in one place, when the dictator makes a mistake, then he just uses his power to hide the mistake, to prevent anybody else from pointing it out, and basically just saying that, oh, well, this is not because of me, this is because of external enemies and internal traitors, I need even more power. When the system makes a mistake, it tends to go even to more extremes. And in a democracy, there is enough, usually, self-correcting mechanisms and enough distribution of power that if there is a mistake, even an institutional mistake, it can be corrected. It's often messy. And, we look at the mess that the U.S. political system, the U.S. society is now in, and also Israeli society. And it's not all bad. Because, again, looking back, you think, let's say, the last time we saw this level of mess in the Western world, in Western democracies, was in the 1960s. And if you compare, say, the United States in the 1960s with political assassinations and riots much worse than we see now, and terrible polarization, and armed confrontations, and the segregation, and all that, and you compare this to the peace and quiet and orderliness of the Soviet Union, then you would expect that the American system is very close to disintegration, whereas the Soviet system seems to be impervious. It will last for thousands of years. And fast forward 15, 20 years, it's the Soviet Union that collapses, not the United States. Now, this is not a guarantee. History doesn't just repeat itself. But the messiness of democracy is not always a bad sign. And going back also to the issue of social media and AI and all the information technology, part of what is happening, and this again goes back to the alt-right groups and so forth, is that many groups, many people who were excluded from the system previously are now joining it. They have a voice. I mean, people miss the time when there were just 3 TV stations in the US, so everybody were on the same page. But it meant that a lot of people were excluded. Now, when you open things up, and so a lot of new groups enter the discussion, and at first it creates chaos. And it's dangerous. I completely agree, it's dangerous. But if you manage to kind of work it through, the new balance that you eventually create is far more inclusive. It allows many more people to voice their opinions, including the people who lose their jobs because of automation, for example. So I wouldn't despair of the United States, or I wouldn't despair of the democratic system in general. Even though, yes, when like, I don't know, you open the screen and it's frightening what's happening there.
Well, yeah, I agree with you that having some kind of avenue for expression or release can be very, very constructive. Right now, the American political system is less able to incorporate multiple points of view because it's a duopoly. So if you had a multi-party system, then I think that you could wind up in a better place. The question is how you go from this fixed duopoly to a different version, and that's something I'm spending every day on right now, trying to make happen.
Well, we'll have to see how the Sapiens party polls at some point, right, Eva?
No, we won't.
We won't. All right. Well, in lieu of that, we can just encourage more politicians to read your books. So I want to close with hopefully a note of optimism. Let's pretend we're all optimists here, and this will hopefully be just a one-word answer for you guys. If we do not only survive, but also thrive, coming out of the current environmental and other challenges we face, that humanity faces, what do you think is the one human quality or characteristic that is really going to be key in ensuring that survival and thriving? Whoever thinks of it first, please jump in.
I'll use 2 words, innovation and creativity.
Right? Yuval?
No, I think it's adaptability. It's our ability to reinvent ourselves, and maybe even not reinvent ourselves, but kind of rediscover ourselves. We know very little about ourselves. We don't know the full human potential. Part of what is worrying about the rise of AI is that it might kind of prevent us from realizing our full potential even before we understand it. But what could help us reach a more positive future is precisely this hidden potential that, you look throughout history and you see that humans repeatedly surprise themselves because they know so little about themselves, because they don't really understand what's going on inside them. So I hope there are still a few more positive surprises waiting for us down the line.
That is very optimistic.
Very optimistic. Great note to end on. Yuval, Andrew, thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.